wildness. Thank you all for coming. I'm Charles Goodrich, the director of the Spring Creek Project. We're hosting last night the movie Wrench, new biography of Edward Abbey. I see some of you who were there last night. And thinking about what's all the talk about the wild lately. Is it something that is just cachet, or is it something that's essential to us? And in two lights in particular. Last night we talked, in regards to the movie, we were looking at the wild in regards to activism, in particular Abbey's inspiration of monkey wrenching and people who were lived the life that David briefly imagined for his students. And today we'll pick up on that, but we also want to talk about the wild in writing and how we can entertain more energy, more innovation, and so we're going to blend those two today, the wild in our lives and in our writing. At the end of the movie last night, Ken's slide was photographed talking to the students and others outside, and he's saying, you know, when you think about your wrench, people tend to think of that as monkey wrenching. Well, the wrench is your gift. So whatever you have to give to whatever causes you believe in, your gift is your wrench. So he said, bring your wrench. So we're gonna focus on how we can find and better use our personal wrenches on behalf of nature and culture. And to help us do that today, we have three wonderful presenters and a moderator. David Gessner needs no further introduction, except to say that he is the author of the new book, which is brought into town, All the Wild That Remains, Edward Abbey, Wallace Stegner, and the American West, and a bunch of earlier books, including the first book that I discovered him called Sick of Nature, which he railed against kind of romanticized depictions of nature, and a biography of John Hay, The Prophet of Dry Hill, and a bunch of other ones that have won a bunch of great awards. He's also the founding director of the wonderful journal Ecological, and a professor at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, for which he has come. Well, he's on a long book tour, so he's come from many cities. And after he reads tonight in the Visiting Writers Series, he will go down to the Andrews Forest and spend a week in our great Northwest Forest, which he has not spent a lot of time in, so we're looking forward to having him in residence there. Maria Spagna comes from near wilderness herself. She lives in Stehekin, Washington. Anybody been to Stehekin? If you have, you took a long boat ride or plane to get into. You hiked into Stehekin? You flew into Stehekin on wings. That's a great wild thing to do. Stehekin's way up Richland, and a very remote community where Maria worked for many, many years as a, well, just many years, we should say, just many years, as a trail maintenance person for the Forest Service and others, and also writing. And she has a couple of wonderful books from OSU Press, and a new one just out called 100 Skills You'll Need for the End of the World as We Know It, of which she is a master in those skills. So she's going to read tomorrow night at Grassroots Books, and she has another book coming out soon, which she'll tell us about either later or tomorrow. Tim Jensen is Assistant Professor and Director of Writing in the School of Writing, Literature, and Film. He's currently on a book that re-examines rhetoric's approach to pate, the passions of persuasion. So how do people get us? Well, and Edward Abbey was a master of passionate persuasion. Working with contemporary rhetorical theory, social movement studies, and critical affect emotion studies, this project advances the concept of the common sensorium. His recent work appears in Mega-Rhetorics of Global Development and the Journal of Aesthetics and Protest. Cool. I asked Jake Hamlin to moderate. Jake is the Professor of History and Director of OSU's Environmental Arts and Humanities program. So a program that very deliberately brings together awarenesses of science and humanities. And Jake has written about many environmental subjects himself. His first book, Oceanographers in the Cold War, assessed the military, political, and economic motivations behind international cooperative ventures in the marine sciences after World War II. And his most recent book is a fascinating book, harrowing book, read at your caution, Arming Mother Nature, the Birth of Catastrophic Environmentalism. So I think David, we're going to go David, Maria, Tim, and then Jake's going to come up and take your questions, and we're going to work this out, figure this all out, and then we're going to take off our clothes. Thanks so much.
Is this what we want to do?
Either way, you've got a mic there, or whatever you want to be.
Well, as I said, well, this is great, actually. All right. So, yeah, there was some wildness in that video, but what I want to kind of concentrate on a little bit is voice, because already several things that Charles said and that we've chatted about are popping into my head. Obviously, part of what we're trying to do, part of what I was trying to do with those students and what we're trying to do, I wrote this phrase down this afternoon, is slip past the gate. We're all reading so much, and there's so much we could possibly look at, and so much that we quickly dismiss. How do we slip something past the gate? You know, how do we kind of Trojan horse in some of these ideas before we're dismissed? And I'm going to kind of use creative writing as a way to think about that, because I think our environmental voices, like our writing voices, first of all, have to be, as Charles just pointed out, like Ken Slate said, are wrenches. And for each of us, and this is, I don't mean to instantly turn to the cliche of know thyself, but for each of us, our wrenches are going to be a little different. And one of the ways I think we slip past the gate is to make it new, right? One of the ways we slip against it, probably the only good phrase I ever heard in my rather lame grad school at University of Colorado Boulder, was going against the grain, you know? What's our brain doing when it's looking at all that stuff on the internet, or all these possible subjects? And what makes it stop and pause, you know, is a hugely important point. I think this Beyond Abbey and Stegner is in the subtitle here, but I'm going to start with Abbey and Stegner, in part because I just wrote a book about them and I've been talking about them so much. And if you saw the movie last night, or even if you didn't, if you've heard Abbey speak, Ken Slate, who kind of starred in the movie, taught me to do the impression he's been doing for years, which is you don't move your lower jaw. It comes from here. It's gurgly, but it's powerful and it's deep. And that's a voice, right? And Stegner, and this shocked me, I hadn't heard Stegner's voice. You know, I knew he grew up in Saskatchewan, moving through the West. I knew he had as close to a frontier childhood as someone born in 1909 could have. And he sounds like William F. Buckley in one interview I heard with him, which is really fascinating in a way, because in some basic level, Abbey's beliefs were countercultural and Stegner's were of culture. And one of the questions I've been getting is, you know, obviously I contrast these two in my book, and as I write early on, I could do a whole chapter just on their hairstyles. You know, on perfectly white coiffed Stegner over here, wild shaggy Abbey over here. But somehow both of these voices penetrated, somehow both slipped past the gate. And I want to examine a little bit how they did that. One of the questions that I get during interviews is, what have you learned, you know, and what's your takeaway? And I actually thought about it rather than doing the reflex action. And my environmental takeaway is really in line with what we saw last night in Wrench. From Abbey, I kind of take away this idea that in the power of symbol, in the power of kind of direct, ballsy strikes, you know, and the energy that comes from that. I mentioned last night, and since I only see a couple people there, I will repeat a joke, which I try not to do.
Push that mic away from you a little bit, kind of painting.
You know, I can easily talk to everybody without a mic at all. If that's okay.
See if they can hear.
You guys good?
Yeah.
Man in the hat back there, can you hear me? No?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll project more. I'll do my later self rather than my earlier. The joke was, it's not really a joke. I was walking around Walden Pond a few years ago with my then 8-year-old daughter up on my shoulders, and my wife next to me. We turned the corner and saw the foundation rocks where Thoreau's cabin had been. And my wife looked at my daughter and pointed and said, "That's where the man lived who ruined Daddy's life." and what I see in Abbey is potential life ruiner. This side of Thoreau, I've never seen a better converter. I've never heard more stories of, I was in Ohio working as a shoe salesman and I read Desert Solitaire and now I'm a ranger in the desert. And so how did he do this? And to me, it was through a voice. And I'd just like to read a couple paragraphs from the book about what I think of is the power of Abbey's voice. And let's see if I can find this real quick. I have it marked, so I should be able to find it. Sorry about that. I thought I had it marked. Here, let me do two things at once. Here we go. Above all else, his voice tells the truth. Throughout his work, Abbey was honest about his own faults, admitting the way lust preyed on him, admitting his own grumpiness and impatience, admitting his anger at the ways of the modern world, admitting his own intolerance. Those faults freely admitted gain the trust of readers and join a concert that includes an active intellectual curiosity, a ready sense of humor, and a deep appreciation and love of the land. So while all we are really reading are just marks on the page, what we get is the illusion of a person talking to us. Abbey is more than any writer I know this side of Montaigne, alive on the page. Cut his sentences, as Emerson said of our first essayist, and they bleed. Our modern curator of the essay, Philip Lopate, once compared being in a Max Beerbohm essay to being in a video game of the writer's mind. Well, there's no video game quite like Abbey's. Read other essayists after him, E.B. White, for instance, and they seem too tame, too civilized, too controlled. You appreciate their subtlety and craft, but you get none of the raw joy, none of the silliness, none of the fun of Abbey. Next to theirs is prose with a pole up its ass. Abbey let loose, if not in person where he was known to be shy, then on the page where it counted. The miracle is that his work does not come off more often as mere ranting. Any fool with a pen can go on a tirade, write a letter to an editor, and there were times that Abbey can sound like that too, but rarely. Our moods do not believe in each other, said Emerson. All of Abbey's statements, no matter how boldly put, are open to second thoughts, or at least second jokes. Not that he changes his mind, but that he can come to the same material with a different part of his mind. I think that's a hugely important thing. We were talking last night, speaking of voices, of two voices we heard in the films. One was Dave Foreman, Earth First founder, and you saw him up there, and he looked a little, this is going to sound awful, but he looked a little in his energy like old Hitler newsreels in terms of just like, and it was a voice that was important for the time, right? But then we heard Tim Christopher, and there was even though he was a very young man, he was very composed, and you could, and it was the right voice for the time. I think just like with writing, we have to avoid the cliches of voice, right? So I rolled my eyes a little during the movie when the Earthbursters were dressed up as bears and had their beads, and not because that's bad, but because there's another way you don't slip past the gate. As long as I can look and say that's a cliche, oh, they're just crazy environmentalists, then I don't keep going. Or not I, but every person doesn't keep going, right? So I think that was Abbey's way. Humor was a huge part of it, but humor, if he just had passion, it would sound like MSNBC or Fox, right? He's just going ranting. But he's got something interspersed, and that's the voice that helps. I don't want to take up too much more time because I think the Q&A is the fun part, but I will say about Stegner's voice, though in his actual voice sounded like William F. Buckley, the thrilling thing for me about his voice is the big picture ability to make connections. One of my favorite Stegner quotes is, "Largeness is a lifelong affair." He meant this personally in terms of being more magnanimous and trying to be a good man, but he also meant it in terms of connecting the dots, which is something he did. It was characteristic of his mind and his voice to see something, extrapolate, and make a larger general theory of it. An example would be his childhood, which was spent charging around the West with his big rock candy mountain-seeking father, who was always looking for the next score, and who thought he found it briefly in Saskatchewan until drought drove them out. It was characteristic of him to see this, and see the aridity, and see the place, and make larger connections about how we live in the West as boomers and stickers, as boomers and nesters. And he was always seeing the thing itself, because he was a novelist, right? So he needs the concrete stuff, but he's seeing the bigger thing. And I'll just read one paragraph from Stegner. One thing I said in the book is he knew the fundamentals, but he didn't have our fundamentals. You know, he had aridity, a rapacious attitude toward the land, snowpack's importance. He didn't have so much pine bark beetles. He didn't have, obviously climate change, but he's a voice that I'd love to hear right now. Some people are too young to have watched All in the Family here, but if you remember the beginning when they say, "Mr. We could use a man like Herbert Hoover again," I've been singing that with Wallace Stegner filling in. And I really feel that it's a voice. So this is a voice, so we get the timbre and tone of Abbey's, the wild contradictions, the humor, the passion. And Stegner's a voice that is smart and sharp, does not brook fools, and is brisk, I would say. So here's just one little paragraph, which I am going to find this time. Things are going so well except for this finding. The history of the West until recently has been the history of the importation of humid land habits and carelessness into a dry land that will not tolerate them, and of the indulgence of an unprecedented personal liberty and atomic individualism in a country that experience says can only be successfully tamed and lived in by a high degree of cooperation. Inherited wetland habits have given us a damaged domain. I'll leave it off there. I might read a little bit more of Stegner later. I know it's not particularly dry here, but I've been flying around the West, and as I told these guys, before coming into Albuquerque, it was like Mad Max landscape, and then the Rio Grande was like this little tiny brown trickle. And once again, I sang my little "Mr. We Could Use a Man Like Wallace Stegner Again" song. It's my ditty as I drive, as I go around the West. So I'll leave it at that. I think this does not mean, as a lot of young people have thought when they read Ed Abbey, that I should be like Ed Abbey. It means I should be like myself. I, for instance, when I read Ed Abbey, don't pretend I'm a hillbilly from Appalachia. I grew up a WASP in New England, so my voice is not going to reflect, Abbey's. I think the lesson from reading him is that really, that being oneself, not on the page and in person, and that's pretty exciting. So I'll move on down the road. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll find the right place.
Yeah, you let me know. Is that too close? What do you think? Right there?
Sounds pretty good.
About there? In the back? You okay? I get wound up and I get loud, so tell me if I do. Thanks Charles and Spring Creek Project for having me here, and everyone at OSU, and thank you all for being here inside on a gorgeous sunny afternoon. It is an honor and a privilege and a delight to be with you all. Last week I was also traveling, and I went down to Riverside, California, which is where I grew up, and saw my mom in the house that I lived in until I was 18 years old. And my mom, bless her heart, every time I come now, she wants to have a little dinner party, She calls it taco night and has all our old friends from church and the neighborhood and their kids and grandkids, and they all come over to the house. And I've learned to just really love these events. They make me feel such a sense of comfort to be among people I've known that long, and a sense of wonder, because how can we have so much still in common? I live a very different life than they do, and still those connections are so strong. And mostly gratitude. You know, these are amazing people. They're teachers and social workers, and they work at the food bank, and they visit prisoners, and they nurture their friends and family, and they nurtured me and nurture me still. They taught me how to be a good citizen of the world, and I'm just overwhelmed with gratitude. And still, when I get on that airplane to come home, I'm so relieved that I found another way to be in the world. And so about a month ago, I picked up David's book, fabulous book, and I had so many of the same feelings. You know, I had this sense of immense comfort to be with Abbey and Stegner again. They're writers who meant just a ton to me when I first moved to the wilderness. I think I devoured almost everything they wrote, maybe skipped some of those Abbey novels in there, but you know, I felt that comfort and I felt that wonder, like they're still so relevant, which is largely the point of your book, and how many passages still resonate and make sense. And I felt such gratitude for what they've taught me about how to be a writer and how to care about the world we live in and how to be a good citizen of the world. And still, when I finished, I thought, thank goodness we may be finding another way. And so to explain myself, I want to tell you a little bit about my own journey. I was the kid who always wanted to be a writer, and my mom blames that on John Boy Walton, and I watched way too much television in the 1970s. So it stayed with me through grade school and middle school. In high school, I started having different interests, and by the time I got to college and I was an English major, it was the kind of English major where you read great books and you analyze them, but it wasn't writing like I had wanted to do when I wanted to be John Boy Walton. So I get to time to graduate, and like a lot of English majors, I was totally lost and didn't know what I was going to do with myself. So I was wandering the halls at U of O where I went, and I don't know if they still have these, but they used to have the recruiter posters, you know, they had a postcard attached to them. And so I tore off the postcard, and it was to volunteer in a national park. And I ended up being offered a job as a volunteer in Canyonlands National Park in southern Utah in Abbey Country. I had never been there. And so I got up before dawn in Eugene and started driving and drove all the way. And of course, by the time I get to the Needles district of Canyonlands, it's way after dark. And I don't know where I'm going. And so I just was exhausted and pulled over and threw my sleeping bag in the sand. And I woke up to the most startling experience you can imagine, right? You're in this blue sky and these orange rocks and the smell of sage after the rain. And I knew, like in that moment, I knew my life just changed. My life has changed. And it had. I ended up spending that season there in Canyonlands and figured I would stay there the rest of my life. The next winter, it's seasonal jobs, you know, so you have to fill out, at that time the Park Service application had 150 bubbles you had to fill in. And it turned out that I missed a bubble. And so they couldn't hire me. So here I am, I'm working as a temp in an insurance brokerage in Seattle. And I get the phone call and I start to cry, and God bless the woman on the other end who felt sorry for me and said, oh honey, you know, you seem to like the Northwest. There's a little tiny park up there called North Cascades that's still hiring. Why don't you get in touch with them? So I did, and they hired me to work in Stehekin, Washington, this gorgeous little valley you can only get to by ferry or hiking in, that's surrounded by glaciers and waterfalls and rivers and trees. And you know, I went there and knew I was home and started to settle into this seasonal lifestyle of living in the woods. And as soon as I was living that life, guess what I wanted to do? I wanted to write. I wanted to write again. I wanted to capture all of that. And that desire to write came back, and I spent a ton of time writing. I would write at night in my tent after work, and I would write in the off season, and I would fill journals. And even then, objectively, I knew that it was terrible. That I didn't know how to write at all. That I could say over and over, it's beautiful, it means a lot to me. Nobody's going to read that. So I went to graduate school in creative writing. I went to Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff because they gave me a TA-ship. And I got there and they said, in that era, fiction or poetry? I was like, poetry's scary, so I think I'll go with fiction. And it turned out being terrific training for me. It actually taught me how to shape things into a story and how to create characters and use dialogue. And still, in that world, I was a little bit uncomfortable. And it all came down to these rules that they told us. I don't know if they still use these rules in fiction writing. Somebody can tell me. They told us that there are 3 kinds of stories. There's man versus man. Has anybody heard this? There's man versus nature, and there's man versus himself. Those are the only 3 kinds of stories. Well, that is fraught in 1,000 ways for me. First off, not a man. And also, if I liked conflict, I would have gone to law school and made a lot more money. So I never really could get my stride in fiction writing. And the very last semester I was there, we had a new professor who came in and said, oh, that's all wrong. She said, it's close, but really good stories are all humans connecting with humans connecting with nature, and humans connecting with ourselves. Just that one little change in words made all the difference in the world for me. And things started to click. And I started writing essays, I started having success publishing them. I finished school, and the university offered me a job to stay. And in one of the most excruciating decisions in my life, I decided I didn't want to do that. I wanted to go back to trail crew. I wanted to go back to the woods. And I went back to the North Cascades and ended up working 15 years on trail crews, mostly in the backcountry. So for 8 months of the year, I slept outside more than I slept inside. Mostly clearing big trees out of the trail and building bridges and clearing brush. It's a dream life, really. But it was there, working on trails, that my attitudes about wilderness started to, as our president would say, evolve. So I'm going to read a little passage from my book that's coming out this September called Reclaimers, that gives you a sense of how that transformation started or how it happened. And it refers to flower sniffers. Everybody's familiar with this term? We used to use it as like one step beyond a tree hugger, someone with a real hands-off approach to wilderness. If I wasn't exactly a flower sniffer, it was hard not to side with them. You could see the stakes so clearly in the Pacific Northwest in the early 90s, the short window between the Reagan era of unbridled clear-cutting and the closed mill era when the endangered spotted owl brought it all to a halt. In those days, you could walk to work on a trail and see fresh slash for miles on one side of a boundary sign, and 7-foot diameter old-growth cedars on the other. Who wouldn't choose the cedars? The language of the 1964 Wilderness Act was seared into our hearts, a place where man is only a visitor. The literature in the ranger station translated it to sound bites. Take only pictures, leave only footprints, leave no trace. Flower sniffing influenced everyone I worked with in some way, an entire subculture for whom wilderness was very nearly a religion. Over time, my faith began to erode. Work in the woods long enough and you learn at least 2 lessons. First, even with hand tools, you can get a lot more done than you think. Second, no matter how devastating the effects of that work may appear, they will fade. You can clear a 10-foot swath, and by the next season, it'll look as though it suffered years of neglect. Allow real years to add up, and for better or worse, you'd think humans had never touched the place. Of course, the Pacific Northwest is unique, not as dry as California or the interior West, and not even as close to as dry as the Southwest. But the lesson wasn't so much about fecundity or even fragility as about habitation. The longer I worked, the more I realized, no way were we the first humans to work in this so-called wilderness. Which made me suspect that the scars we'd left were less damaging than the all or nothing philosophy that we bought into. So that was step 1. I started to think this whole untrammeled thing, there's something a little bit iffy about that. There had to have been other people out here before. But there were other things going on in my life at the same time. My partner, my wife-to-be, Lori, and I bought land and started that long process of settling and sinking roots and building a cabin that, sort of from your Abbey to Stegner transition, if you're going to do the stereotype. And, you know, climate change is coming too, so in the space of about 5 years, we had 300-year floods. They're gonna have to think of a new word for that kind of flood, because they would come, we'd plant a garden and build a fence, and it would get washed away, and we'd do it again, and it would get washed away, and we'd do it again, and it got washed away. We didn't do it the fourth time. But at the same time, we were going through all these catastrophic wildfires, right? And they'd come through, and some of them were within a mile of our house, and so we became volunteer firefighters. We'd been firefighters for the Park Service and the Forest Service, but the community started its own district, and now we're trying to do defensible space and working around our property and our neighbor's property, and we're doing all this planting and replanting and building and rebuilding, and it starts to feel futile, and still it feels so crucial, right? What else are you gonna do? This is our home. We have to do something. And the more we worked at it earnestly, the more I began to just question this whole ideal of nature that's something separate from us, something that we can, you know, preserve or defend or even restore, but otherwise we shouldn't mess with it. You know, Robin Wall Kimmerer, do you know this writer, has a great book out called Braiding Sweetgrass. And in it, she describes a scene where she goes in front of an auditorium of brand new environmental studies majors, like 200 of them, and she asks them, who can think of a time when people behaved badly in nature, when they hurt nature? Well, that's a no-brainer, you know, everybody's hand went up. And then she asks, well, who can think of a time when people behaved well, did well by nature? And not one hand went up in the auditorium. And I think that sort of jives with what I see sometimes with new people coming to work for the Park Service or the Forest Service, and probably was my underlying attitude when I first went to work for the park, is, you know, people bad, nature good. But now when I think of it, it breaks my heart. And so about 4 years ago, I set off on a journey to find places besides my tiny little valley where people are reclaiming nature in the very best way. And I ended up going mostly up and down the West Coast through the mountains and along the rivers, and tons of amazing stories, amazing people. The three that I ended up focusing on all were led by octogenarian women, just by happenstance. These were amazing women. The first was the removal of the Condit Dam on the White Salmon River. 89-year-old Phyllis Clausen is probably the polar opposite of Hey Duke, if there ever was one. Soft-spoken, precise, small, well-dressed, and yet has the exact same agenda, and in the fall of 2012 was successful. And not surprisingly, the journey also took me very often to indigenous people, you know, the people who have worked and lived on this land a lot longer than the rest of us. So that Tumbisha Shoshone reclaimed their homeland in Death Valley in the year 2000 from the federal government, and they're working on what they do next. The Mountain Maidu are a tiny little federally unrecognized tribe in the Northern Sierras that just reclaimed the Sacred Valley from Pacific Gas and Electric, which is amazing. And the coolest thing about this story is they're not just reclaiming title to the land, they're reclaiming their old practices on the land. And so by talking to these people, these women, and reading books like Robin Kimmerer's book by Kat Anderson that's called Tending the Wild, I learned about this concept called traditional ecological knowledge. And they call it TEK, everything has to have an acronym, right? It's the knowledge for how to use the land respectfully that's passed down through generations and becomes part of the cultural fabric. And what appeals to me so much about this concept is that it's more about connection than it is about conflict, right? It's all about connection. And it gives us the permission to try to make things work better. And for me, I guess, coming from where I have, the operative word is work. I think when we talk about wild, sometimes we undervalue just getting your hands dirty and getting your back sore and plodding through piles of paperwork, because God knows that's work. And work is just the key to reconnecting in that way, I think. As much as it appeals to me, that whole idea of Abbey the idler out in the wilderness, it worries me if our only relationship to nature is when we go on vacation. It seems a little bit too much like a fling, you know? So the last thing I'll say is that I think that writing certainly counts as work, and there are tons of ways to do that work. We can follow Abbey and Stegner's example and celebrate the places we love and encourage people to defend those places. And we can also write about the super messy relationships that we have with nature. I think in literature, the best stories aren't about simple relationships or relationships we understand. They're about the big messes we make and how we try to clean them up. And we can just look for new ways to write. I think of the essays of Amy Leach. She's a wonderful essayist. Brian Doyle's essays are coming from someplace different when he's talking about nature. And you've got Elena Passarello here to teach all these strategies for writing new essays. So I think I'll leave it at that. That's where I'm coming from, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation. Tim?
And this overwhelming urge to clap after both of these.
Yeah.
So I think one of the first things I noticed in both of those presentations is I think it's fantastic that Abbey and Stegner are still resonating. It also makes me incredibly nervous that there is such a resonance between what Abbey was talking about, the problems they faced, right, the tactics that they used then, and that we have the exact same problems now. So in preparation for this talk, there's this one line that just kept resurfacing, and it was, it's in the Monkey Wrench Gang, and it's where Doc Sarvis is characterizing George Washington Hayduke. And for those of you who have read the Monkey Wrench Gang and know the main protagonist, George Washington Hayduke, one of my favorite parts of that, seemingly loud name is that Abbey's father was named Paul Revere Abbey. Awesome.
His brother was William Tell.
Just a hint to all of you about to have babies. So Doc is speaking with Bonnie Abzug, who's expressing her concerns in trusting Hayduke, a man who loves explosives and alcohol in equal measure and loves them deeply, and who says things like, what's more American than violence? Violence is more American than pizza pie. She has concerns. So, and in this curious attempt to put Bonnie at ease, Doc simply says, young George, all fire and passion, a good, healthy psychopath. So chew on that phrase, a good, healthy psychopath. And if we want to be clinical about it, Hayduke actually has far more characteristics of a sociopath than a psychopath. In his guiltless disregard for societal norms, rules, obligations, coupled with a really staggering lack of impulse control, low threshold for aggressive response. So in contradistinction then to a psychopath, for example, Hayduke actually feels a deep sense of responsibility and has enormous empathy, just not for the developers who are ravaging the lands he considers sacred, nor for the hordes of Americans who are willing to receive the benefits of such development, or I would say more accurately, pay for it with a portion of their conscious and ability to even acknowledge environmental devastation. But this reference to Hayduke as a psychopath, and importantly, paradoxically, a good, healthy one, is for me this potent mark of a larger thread running across the Monkey Wrench Gang and much of Abbey's other work. And that is, in the fight for wild, whether it's wild lands or wild minds, one will eventually, inevitably, undergo a reconsideration of what constitutes crazy. And more specifically, I think Abbey is actually inviting us to think about who defines madness, how madness operates differently at an individual rather than at a collective level, and importantly, the role that anger and love and passion plays in all of this. So you can see part of how Abbey tinkers with these issues of rationality, irrationality, sanity, insanity throughout the Monkey Wrench Gang, whose main characters are constantly asking whether or not their co-conspirators and themselves are indeed crazy. And of course, at the same time, regularly condemning those that they consider their enemy as crazy bastards in need of stopping. So I'll just point out two other instances that can contrast with this first one, Doc's characterization of Hayduke as a good crazy in reply to Bonnie's declaration. They're both crazy, Doc, in reference to another character, Smith. Toward the conclusion of the book, we learn more about Hayduke's stretch as a POW and the despair he experienced as a Viet Cong prisoner. And he says, quote, I had to think about something clean and decent or go crazy. So I thought about the canyons. I thought about the desert down along the Gulf Coast. I thought about the mountains from Flagstaff up to Wind Rivers. And then after the VC let him go, he says, then came 6 months in Army psycho wards. The Army thought I wasn't adjusted right for civilian life. Am I crazy, Doc? So the wild that Hayduk retreats to when he's in the camp in order to maintain some sense of stability and orientation, both cognitively and emotionally, is what saves him. And for Abbey, I think it's our connection, obviously, to place. It's the love of landscape, and more importantly, the way that those landscapes induce us into being who we are. This is our fundamental ethical compass, is the connection to the wild. Now, the Army, of course, brands Hayduk as crazy, institutionally and bureaucratically, but it also does so personally, at least enough that Hayduk, if he doesn't believe the diagnosis on the whole, some doubt still remains, because he ends that with, am I crazy, Doc? To which Doc responds, as any true friend would, absolutely. Certified psychopath if I ever saw one. So this instance of the Army's certification points us to the way that institutions of culture, whether it's military, governmental, financial, they set the boundaries for what is and isn't crazy, and for how it's dealt with, of course. So Hayduk in a psycho ward, or for millions of Americans with a pharmacology industry that's bigger now than at any point of history, what is and isn't madness is not always an objective fact. In fact, it's never an objective fact. So this is the level at which cultural norms are made, so that soldiers who tragically experience trauma should be checked for madness, but not those who orchestrate the war and who send young men into battle. And we see another instance of this kind of cultural norming or cultural priming in the book's preface, which interestingly is called The Aftermath, in which Abbey envisions a future scenario in which the commemoration of a bridge spanning Arizona and Utah is blown up right after the suits cut a giant symbolic ribbon with giant symbolic scissors. And as the authorities confer in the aftermath, one suggests that this bridge blow is just a warm-up to a much larger event. And just what the hell are they planning next, the governor asks. Colonel Crumbo points fingers to the immediate east, indicating that thing. The dam? Yes, sir. Not the dam. Yes, sir. We have reasons to think so. Not Glen Canyon Dam. I know it sounds crazy, but that's what they're after. So despite the Monkey Wrench Gang being published in 1975, it's not just plausible that someone proposing the demolition of dams today would get the exact same response. That's crazy. But what I see Abbey doing in his works is skillfully and forcefully removing the period at the end of such a statement, that's crazy, and encouraging us to put a question mark there instead. To point out that our cultural institutions define norms that benefit the existing order of capitalism at the expense of biodiversity and functioning ecosystems certainly isn't a new claim. I would say I hear it at least 6 times a day. We know, for instance, that thinking economically is the norm, time is money, and there are plenty of philosophers and academics who could put it in much better terminology than I could, call it something like hegemonic ratioism. But there's this one rapper in the mid-90s, DJ Quick, I think, who got it perfect. He said, if it don't make dollars, it don't make sense. And I think that Abbey is asking us to approach exactly this issue, but in unique ways, and look not just at issues of logic and persuasion by means that get deemed rational persuasion, but instead attend to how our passions for the wild are involved, and then, of course, the way that they translate into activism. And I think we can think about this along 2 lines. The first being the ways in which dominant culture encourages us to feel, entrains us to feel, really, enculturates us, and the implications that this has in our activist tactics. And the second is the way that we cultivate our connection, of course, to the environment, and quite literally feel for the wild, touch the roses, feel the roses. So, but I'm going to move here really quickly because I think David Jensen actually has a quote that is very much in the spirit of Abbey and summarizes what I'm trying to get at. He writes, "It would be a mistake to think this culture clear-cuts only forests. It clear-cuts our psyche as well. It would be a mistake to think it dams only rivers. We ourselves are damned and damned by it as well. It would be a mistake to think it creates dead zones only in the ocean. It creates dead zones in our hearts and minds. It would be a mistake to think it fragments only our habitat. We too are fragmented, split off, shredded, rent, torn. So just as our economic model propels an exploitative extraction and reshaping of our natural environment, our collective emotional and affective environment is also being shaped systematically, violently, to serve the interests of capital. This is my argument. I was joining you to, asking you to join with me. And when these territories of desire and imagination are stolen, ravaged, and toxified, it becomes that much easier for the theft and destruction of natural landscapes to go uncontested, unnoticed. So when Hayduke is introduced to us, he has just returned from war to find, quote, a smudge of poisoned air overhung his homeland, a dump for the gaseous garbage of the copper smelters, the filth that Kennecott, Anaconda, Phelps Dodge, and America's Smelting and Refining Company were pumping through stacks into the public sky. Hayduke smelled something foul in all this. The smoldering bitterness warmed his heart and nerves. The slow fires of anger kept his cockles warm, his hackles rising. Hayduke burned. So I would say that we need the burn to achieve social change of any structural significance. And this is part of the reason we are systematically steered away from the slow fires of anger. And so it seems pretty obvious to point out that anger is a large point in Abbey's works, but the reason why I want to point out that, the reason why I want to focus on it today is because I think that there's the difference between anger and guilt in our activism is substantial, and I see much more of the latter in today's tactics. So, like I said, I think we're frequently steered away from anger, or more appropriately, righteous indignation, and we're actually steered more towards feelings of guilt. And I think that this has resulted in a conflation of activism with purity. A type of personal purity then becomes my way of expressing my environmental stance. So it becomes about reducing one's sense, literally one's feelings of complicity, and moving away from strategizing effective action that are proportional to the problems in hand. I'm not saying that the former is unimportant, I'm just saying it's not proportional. So specifically, I'd say we're actually steered towards collective guilt, which is the experience of distress or remorse felt by an individual when a group they identify with causes unjustifiable harm. So one does not actually have to participate in the harmful actions, or may do so in a very low degree, but instead the feelings of guilt are connected to identification with the group. And so you internalize the wrongs that have been done, but you haven't necessarily, you're not necessarily guilty for the entirety of it, but you feel that way. And so the best example I can give is the line that they would have in press conferences following in the oily wake of the BP Deepwater Horizon spill, and there was one line they kept moving out, and I know the PR representative they worked with, his name is Sandman, and it's in part, like his name is actually Peter Sandman, but he's known for putting people to sleep. And one of the main strategies they use is to emphasize complicity, show the consumer how they help contribute to the corporate devastation. That's step one. Reassure everyone things are under control, and then reinforce again a degree of complicity. And so it came down to this line. Look, there are no perfect options for cleaning up the spill. It's name your poison. Look, we're all guilty in this affair. If you drive a car, you own part of the spill. And so the difference here, right? So you would just like, yeah, of course, right? Like you are responsible absolutely for the Deepwater Horizon spill. Shame on you. So what happens is we move into a type of reconciliation, and we search for atonement, but we're not moving towards anger. And so this is the big split. With anger, it's an attributional notion. We start looking towards issues of justice and blame and the actants. And then with guilt, we actually move more towards victim narratives, and we search for atonement and reconciliation. So these are big differences. And if we have an environmental activism base that's built on reconciliation and atonement, I'm not saying it's bad, but at the same time, it obscures the degree and the agents in which much of this degradation and devastation is occurring through that. So there's one particular story where I realized just how important this is. I was at a place called Clandestinos, and it was, your absolutely standard anarchist club. In a former life, I was a bike messenger in Denver, and in downtown they had this, super ratty. Everyone had the black jacket, standard issue anarchist notion. They were talking, and they were talking about peak oil. And one anarchist turned to the other. I realized that sounds like a bad joke. And it felt like it at the time, because she said, well, did you drive here? And I watched her, because she did drive there. Absolutely, she looked like she was folding in on herself. And I realized she's not, she is no longer interested in trying to effectively strategize for ways to overcome peak oil, right, or help other people. She is mostly worried about herself and the feelings of shame and guilt that are attendant to. And my next thought was, shit, if the anarchists are doing this, we're in real trouble. If the anarchists are worried about their purity, then, oh man, we have a long way to go. So in actually speaking with Charles about this, the phrase came out, a type of paralysis through purity. And I think that this paralysis of purity is not accidental. In fact, I would argue it's systematically built into the system. And apologies to everyone who saw me give a talk on a very similar topic this past Monday. But all of the different rhetorics that point us towards eco-friendly, I think helps stoke a very low-lying ambient sense of collective guilt. So when I read on my yogurt cup that we can all make a difference, I am invited into a feeling of, not necessarily conscious, but constant feeling of guilt in the environment. And then this symbolic yogurt cup becomes my way to atone for the grave environmental devastation. Okay, so you've got guilt and anger. And I argue that we need the anger in Abbey, that we need more of this. But I want to be specific about it, because I think that the notion that just passion, right, just passion alone is actually a very dangerous thing. So I'll note too that the slow fire, this notion, on the surface contradicts with a very famous, quotation by Abbey that has circulated a lot through activist groups. And he said, one final paragraph of advice: do not burn yourselves out. Be as I am, a reluctant enthusiast, a part-time crusader, a half-hearted fanatic. Save the other half of yourselves and your lives for pleasure and adventure. It's not enough to fight for the land. It is even more important to enjoy it. So the way that this typically gets read is fight during the week, maybe go, kick off on the weekend, go flank on the weekend. And I actually think that part of this is just due to the way that Adam sets it up, save the other half, right? And in that way, it doesn't show how the two things are connected between love and anger. And so that's what I want to argue for today, is that this notion that the anger is only there if you love something. So in Aristotle, apologies for being a typical rhetorician and returning to Aristotle, but they are absolutely linked. And you actually can't rage unless there is love. Otherwise, there's no reason to get upset if injustice is done. Now, importantly, they mentioned the slow fire instead of, a raging blaze, which might lead to a burnout. And so, more so, I think that in addition to cultivating a love for what your love for the wild, your sense of connection to the land, that we must also cultivate our anger. And so, I'll just leave you with this phrase that anyone can be angry. That is easy. But to be angry with the right person and to the right degree at the right time for the right purpose and in the right way, that is not within everyone's power, and it is not easy.